Hello everybody, my name's Alan Bowley and like you I'm leading rather a strange life at the moment in mid-April during the lockdown, largely confined to home and not being able to get out to explore the countryside like I usually do. For many of us, being confined is a bit of a daunting prospect. Hopefully we've got a bit of open space outside, or at least can listen to the sounds around us. But there are advantages. One of them is the quiet, lack of traffic, no planes going over, and much less general hubbub. The other is time to sit and listen, and maybe on your daily exercise walk listen to the natural world around you. After many years working as an ecologist and a nature reserve manager, I've been privileged to be in close contact with nature and all her marvels, so I thought it might be a good time to try and share some of my experiences with you. Perhaps you haven't noticed that all the things that are going on around you in all the hectic lives that we all lead, but nature is always around us and just takes a bit of time and effort to listen and look and see what's around us. So if you'd like to give it a try, I'm going to start with a few tips and hints which you might try for yourselves, and maybe you could set some tests for the children, whether they can recognize a plant or a bird. So I'm going to start with a few birds that are quite common at the moment. It's always a good time to learn birdsong at this time of year because there's not so many of them around, and also have a look at a few plants which you might find just on the road verges or in Dorset's woods and hedgerows. So here goes. First of all, the blackbird. The blackbird is such a common bird and known to most of us, but sometimes the song gets lost in all the rush of life. It's this beautiful melodious warble, and it's the cockbird's declaration of his territory and also to attract a mate. Now he of course is jet black with a bright yellow bill, but the hen who he's after is a much browner, duller bird, and sometimes a bit speckled, a bit like the youngsters when they hatch a little later on. They're both fond of feeding on the ground in short grass, looking for worms and other invertebrates. I often think of blackbirds as the sentinels of the woodland because very often they're the first ones to give an alarm, their incessant alarm call that you can hear now. But also in the evening, a bit like children going to bed, they're always chattering away, sometimes with their beautiful song, but more often this urgent tick 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 that they make. Well, the next bird is closely related to the blackbird, and this is a song thrush. Now in mid-April, song thrushes are beginning to go off song a bit, but in the early spring I always think of these birds as the real sign that spring is on the way. Once a common sight and sound, song thrushes have actually declined quite dramatically in the last 50 years or so, but with a slight recovery recently. But the song once learnt is easy to remember, hopefully. It's repeated phrases, and after 3 or 4 times they then move on to a different phrase, and you can hear that now. If you hear a tap 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 in the vicinity of a song thrush, it's probably using an anvil, a stone or a rock, to tap away at some unfortunate snail, smashing its way through the skull to get at the nice juicy interior. Occasionally you hear them in the autumn and winter, but most often this is the great bird to listen to for the signs of spring. Well, smallest bird, loudest song is this next one, the wren. It's not actually our smallest bird. The smallest bird is the goldcrest, but you only hear their tiny thin little song right in the tops of conifer trees. But Jenny Wren has a mighty song indeed. It's an explosive cacophony of sound which is most strident at dawn but can also be heard at any time of day. Wrens are very secretive creatures. skulking amongst brambles and thickets, searching for tiny insects. Due to their small size, they're very susceptible to cold weather, and numbers can drop dramatically if there's a prolonged period of snow or ice. I've seen up to 20 come out of a nest box in the winter, but other people have seen many more than that. Due to recent mild weather, particularly here in the south of England, about 10% of all breeding birds are actually now wrens, so they have done very well. So if you glimpse a tiny bird with a cocked up tail disappearing into the undergrowth, listen for an ear-splitting sound to follow. Well, the next bird is the dunnok, or the hedge sparrow. Rather a shy, quiet little bird with a dark brown plumage and a lot of grey around his neck and breast. And the song is quite a charming little twitter, but easy to get lost in all the hustle and bustle of life. But this is a typical bird of hedgerow and garden, and will also often be seen happily clearing up seeds dropped by blue tits underneath the bird feeder in the garden. They nest in dense undergrowth amongst trees or shrubs, and the males may have several wives and vice versa, and so there can be up to 3 broods a year. So certainly one to look out for at the moment. Now you might be able to hear the sound of the rook cawing away. This is one of my favourite birds, and one that always reminds me of my childhood. Now rooks and crows and jackdaws and ravens are all part of the corvid family. That's rather apt at the moment, of course, in this lockdown. But rooks, there's a saying that if you see one rook on his own, it's not a rook, it's a crow, and if you see several crows together, they must be rooks. Well, it's partly true. Rooks are very colonial. They like to nest in groups of, sometimes hundreds together, and often you see them in isolated clumps of trees, sometimes on roundabouts where they're free from predators and can see predators coming. And they're very busy at the moment in mid-April raising their young who hatched about 2 or so weeks ago. Now the carrion crow has got a much harsher, shorter cry that you can hear, a sort of crap crap. Crows are very, very intelligent birds. Their Latin name is actually Corvus coroni, so that's also rather apt at the moment. Crows nest solitarily, and they're very intelligent birds actually, crows. They certainly know what's going on in the world, and so that's partly why they're so successful. Now the jackdaw is probably familiar to all. You often see gangs of them roaming around and uttering their famous cry that gives them their name, of course, Jack, Jack. I once remember jackdaws nesting in my chimney, and I had to send one of my sons up onto the roof to poke the nest down into the fireplace. This was an old nest, I must stress, and we collected about 2 sacks of sticks from their nest. So they're very successful birds as well, and very different from crows and rooks. They're much smaller and very much more grey on their head and on their back. Now we're lucky in this area of the south of England to have quite a lot of ravens around, and ravens have a very, very distinctive crack crack call. Much bigger than the other 3, and very distinctive because they have a very rounded, diamond-shaped tail. They live for a very long time, and of course they're very important birds because they're kept in the Tower of London. But around here they nest on cliffs and in woodlands, and they often pair for life, ravens. So they've suffered greatly over the last few centuries from persecution, but luckily now they've come back quite strongly. Ravens are very particular in Dorset because when the Vikings invaded Dorset and landed at what is now Weymouth in AD 787, the raven was the emblem on their sails because the raven was the personification of their god Odin. But I don't think there's too many Vikings around now, so we should be quite safe seeing a raven. Well, it's always good to start with some familiar resident birds, but I'm also going to just introduce a couple of slightly more exotic ones now who come from a little bit further away. And the first one is this beautiful song from the blackcap warbler. Now the male blackcap is a lovely grey, ash grey colour, but with this beautiful black cap. But the female I think is even more beautiful because she has a lovely chocolate brown cap. And black caps used to be very strictly summer migrants, but with the much warmer winters that we've been experiencing over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's not uncommon now to have black caps feeding in the gardens on bird feeders. They're probably not ones who've bred here, they've probably come from Central Europe, but even so they're not making the long journey down to southern Spain, which they normally do for winter. The black caps are insect feeders, and you can hear them in the woods and sometimes in gardens as well, singing away with a beautiful, beautiful song. Well, the next bird's a really easy one, and one that I love to hear first in the spring, in late March or early April, and that's the chiffchaff. And once you've heard the chiffchaff song, you've heard the chiffchaff song, because it goes chiffchaff. Now we might marvel at how the blackcaps come up from southern Spain, those who don't stay here all year, but the chiffchaff comes from even further and winters right down in northern Africa. And it's quite incredible that these tiny little birds that only weigh about 9 grams can navigate their way down there in the autumn and all the way back in the spring. Now chiffchaffs make a little nest down in the grass or low in the brambles, so next time you're about to clear all those weeds and nettles, perhaps spare a thought for birds like the chiffchaff which nest low in undergrowth like this. Well, that's enough of birds for now. I expect, like me, you've been spending more time in your garden, or perhaps getting out for your walk and seeing more plants in flower. And these weeds, as we call them if they're in the garden, but they're actually wild flowers, at this time of year, in mid-April, are often white for some reason or another. So let's start with one which is common in the woodlands at the moment, or it's just beginning to go over actually, and that's the greatest stitchwort. It's got rather a weak and brittle stem, so they tend to sort of lean up against other plants like primroses and brambles and so forth to give them a bit of stability. When you look closely at them, it looks as if they've got lots of petals, but actually they've only got 5 petals, but they're very, very deeply divided, and they've got this lovely yellow interior where the stamens are. Now the great botanist William Turner, back in the 16th century, he wrote the first book really describing English plants and their uses to people. It's called A New Herbal, and very importantly he wrote this in English rather than Latin, which is what most books had been written at that time, so those people who could read could actually start learning about plants. And one of the things, of course, that gave it its name was he said that this is a good plant to take if you've got a stitch. Well, the next white plant, which is just coming out now in mid-April, is cow parsley, or Queen Anne's lace as people call it. Now this family of umbellifers, as they're called, plants which bear all their flowers in tiny little clusters at the top of the stem, can be quite difficult to identify, but it's not so difficult now because the only one in flower is the cow parsley. It has a slightly hairy stem and lots of quite small flowers. A little bit later on we'll come across hogweed, and that's a much more dense flower cluster, much loved by beetles and other insects looking for nectar, and that has quite a strongly ridged bark. And don't confuse that with the giant hogweed, which is a plant which has been introduced to this country, grows anything up to 10 feet tall, but can give you a nasty rash if you touch it, so keep away from that one. Now I'm not that keen on garlic, but if you are, there's lots of it around in the hedgerows at the moment. Wild garlic, or ramsons. The leaves are a little bit like lily of the valley leaves. They're sort of smooth, lanceolate leaves, but they have this lovely white pointed flower with the stamens, the white stamens sticking out. It's one of the most prolific flowers in Dorset at any rate, and in Culpeper's Herbal it was recommended as a cure for asthma. Well, the last of our white flowers is white dead nettle. Now, don't worry, this is nothing to do with stinging nettles. I think that's why it's called dead nettle. It's just that the leaves look rather similar, these rather jaggedy edge leaves. And it's just about coming into flower now, and the hooded flowers are borne in little clusters all the way up the stem. And if you look under the hood, you'll see the two golden stamens, and these look like two little people, and it's probably what gave this plant the old name of Adam and Eve in a bower. Well, let's add a bit of colour to all those whites. We all know the pansies that we plant in our gardens, or you see in the council parks sometimes, but their wild relatives are smaller and much easily overlooked. And the violets are very closely related to the pansies. And if you're in a sharp-eyed and you've got a good sense of smell, you might find sweet violets, probably more in March than in April. If you're out on the chalk grassland, or when we're allowed to move around, you might be. There's another one called the hairy violet. But the one you're most likely to find is the dog violet. And this has got a lovely deep purple petals. And one of the petals, the central one, is extended out to the back into what's called the spur. And that's a very important feature for telling the difference between the various violets. So have a look around for those when you're on your walk. Now, many plants, of course, are very important for invertebrates, and the violets are very much one of these. And the beautiful silver-washed fritillary butterfly, which you may be lucky enough to see later on in the summer, the caterpillars of that butterfly feed on the leaves of the violets, so very important. Another butterfly that you might look out for at the moment is the speckled wood. You've probably all seen the beautiful bright yellow brimstone, the orange tip, which is the white one, and the male has those orange tips to its wings. You'll have seen peacocks, no doubt, peacock butterflies that is, not the bird. But the speckled wood you often see dancing in little groups of 2 or 3 above the lanes or the hedge banks, and it's a lovely brown butterfly with pale white splodges and spots and with rings on its hind wings. It's an interesting little butterfly because it overwinters as a pupa, so some of the early butterflies that we're seeing at the moment have overwintered, but then these butterflies will breed and have another brood which will be flying in late summer. Well, that's about it for now. Next week we're going to have a look at, well, if you tune in, you'll find out. Cheerio.